A constitutional sheriff is someone who believes that the position of sheriff is not only to enforce the law, but actually interpret and shape the law however they see fit. They believe their authority to do this outranks literally every other authority, including the president. According to its supporters, this idea dates all the way back to the historical definition of sheriffs from medieval England. Hey, remember how they really love defining what a sheriff means? Seems related. See, back then, sheriffs were actually entrusted to interpret the law, a tradition we then brought over here to the States. Of course, time exists, so we have since progressed to a kind of different system. However, back in the 1970s, a white supremacist Christian minister named William Potter Gale wrote a series of articles laying out the theory that sheriffs were actually the only legitimate law enforcement sanctioned by the US Constitution. Gale argued that the power of sheriffs was largely vested in forming a posse of citizens and militias to push back on encroachments against personal freedom, also known as posse comitatus. What encroachments did he list? The federal income tax system, gun control, federal education, and civil rights laws, of course. Gale also proposed common law courts that would try public officials who were accused of violating the Constitution, and recommended hanging anyone who was found guilty. His posse comitatus pitch, a group of heavily armed citizens who you can just trust to do the right thing and shoot the right folks, in particular, really took hold, and ended up inspiring a lot of today's patriot movement style groups like the Sovereign Citizens Movement and the Three Percenters. In fact, Richard Mack, the head of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, is also on the board of directors of the Oath Keepers, that anti-government extremist group that helped to organize the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. Here he is, saying totally normal stuff about his job.
We have to know that we are the guards of the Republic. We are the protectors of liberty. We are the last line of defense for the citizens against tyranny. And let me tell you this too, it is a peaceful and effective process.
Ah yes, peaceful and effective. Mack has appeared on the Alex Jones Show, as well as the white nationalist show, The Political Cesspool. Back in 2014, he called for sheriffs to help county clerks refuse issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. When 3 sitting sheriffs were present to support Cliven Bundy's standoff against the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada, the peaceful and effective Richard Mack was amongst them. But of course, he is but one amongst the truly infamous sheriffs who make national headlines when they buck trends and federal policies, such as Joe Arpaio of Maricopa County in Arizona. You remember Joe? He's the guy who looks like the officiant at a plantation-themed wedding, the Voltron of racist cops. Joe, of course, also subscribes to this general philosophy behind the constitutional sheriff. It's also, and this is pretty key, not real. What I mean is that, to quote a professor at Georgetown University Law Center and former employee for the U.S. Department of Justice, after searching in vain for any legal basis for sheriff supremacy and checking with several others who have studied law enforcement and civilian oversight, I can confirm that a constitutional sheriff with unique autonomy is not actually a thing. But despite this movement being totally bogus, we've amazingly seen a terrifying pattern of sheriffs acting as if they have free range to ignore the law. In 2020, the Alameda County Sheriff's Office started allowing ICE agents into their jails to arrest any undocumented immigrants who might be in there for unrelated crimes, despite the fact that, under California state law, local law enforcement agencies are barred from communicating or cooperating with ICE to carry out immigration enforcement. Assistant Sheriff Tom Madigan defended the practice by saying that it was okay, despite being illegal, because the inmates had been charged with serious crimes and, quote, it's in the sheriff's discretion, and he chooses, in those limited situations, to cooperate. In 2018, Washington voters approved a package of firearms restrictions known as I-1639. This does a lot of the usual stuff like raising the minimum age to buy semi-automatic rifles, expanding background checks, and criminalizing a failure to safely store a weapon that's later used in a violent crime. About a dozen sheriffs from across the state not only came out against the law in principle, but just said flat out that they didn't intend to enforce it, as was the case of a lot of sheriffs in the country, one of those being Richard Mack, of course. Many sheriffs, including Snohomish County, Washington's Adam Fortney, similarly refused to enforce stay-at-home orders and other attempts to limit the spread of COVID-19. Fortney said that the governor's order intrudes on our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which he definitely knows is from the Declaration of Independence and not the Constitution. We must assume. Now, you might be noticing that the laws they choose to reject and embrace coincidentally align with the far right, and so it's probably not at all surprising to hear that a lot of far-right politicians don't really have a problem with this situation, and in some cases, just support it. For example, Georgia gubernatorial candidate Candace Taylor has been on the campaign trail this very summer demanding that her state's sheriffs adopt the constitutional sheriff philosophy or face a firing squad.
They're the highest constitutional officer in their county, and they're going to do the will of the people. I don't mind handcuffing them either. So, I mean it. I've heard of from sheriff corruption all over the state. We've got some awesome sheriffs, and praise the Lord for them. Pray for them. Even if you have a corrupt one, pray for them. And pray that they're replaced really quickly if they're corrupt. But I don't care. I don't mind handcuffing any single person who breaks the law and goes against our government. The Constitution says when you commit treason, it's death by firing squad. I didn't write it. It's in there. It's serious. When you swear to God to uphold a document that says you'll do the will of the people and you will honor every single thing in that Constitution, you do that.
Hey, good news! She fucking lost! Like, really lost, with only 3% of the vote, which in fairness is still 3% more than I'm comfortable with, much like the 3%ers. We just mentioned Joe Arpaio, who of course Trump pardoned after he was convicted of criminal contempt for defying a federal judge's order for him and his deputies to stop racially profiling Latino drivers. And so again, this bold stance of defending the will of the people that these sheriffs are taking and being pardoned for is just, being a fucking racist? Which I guess you could argue is the will of some people, not the good ones, but some. But because these two groups are so closely aligned, we're very clearly seeing a symbiotic relationship form. For example, a Republican sheriff in Barry County, Michigan, named Dar Leaf, plotted to seize voting machines during the November election while in communication with Trump attorneys Sidney Powell and Mike Flynn. He later enlisted a private investigator to look into local election officials. Meanwhile, David Clark, the constitutional sheriff of Milwaukee County from 2002 to 2017, most recently made headlines for urging January 6th participants not to cooperate with federal investigators. Clark was infamous for saying on his radio show that we should suspend habeas corpus and arrest millions of Americans for secretly working with ISIS, and for also spending $75,000 of public funds on 565 Glocks with glow-in-the-dark sights, enough to give each of his 275 deputies 2 of them. But his real claim to fame was overseeing the deaths of his own inmates. In 2016, inmate Terrell Thomas died of dehydration after the water had been turned off for 7 days in his cell. The county medical examiner declared it a homicide, leading Clark to pursue a public harassment campaign against him. Yes, one of his own staffers, for calling attention to a homicide in his own jail. Though the Wisconsin Department of Corrections and the Federal Bureau of Prisons have outlawed the practice, Clark was also repeatedly accused of shackling pregnant inmates in restraints. In 2014, a woman sued the county claiming she was handcuffed and shackled for 21 hours while in labor. In 2016, the newborn baby of a pregnant inmate at Clark's jail died. She later sued the county and claimed that guards had laughed at her and taunted her when she went into labor. Fun fact, Clark was apparently considered for a job at the Department of Homeland Security when Trump was president. Huzzah! Good luck, buddy. Glad it didn't work out for you. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.